March 26, 1889, Warsaw Daily Times, Warsaw, Indiana. Leather was his ruin. A noted character in New England dead. The Old Leatherman's story, or true tale of the life of a mendicant. He loses his affianced bride by rash speculation and makes atonement by dressing in leather scraps and living on the alms of the charitable. Sing Sing, New York, March 26. Jules Bourglet, well known throughout the East as the Old Leatherman, was found dead late Sunday afternoon by some boys near this city. They had been hunting and ventured into a cave intending to build a fire and cook their supper. Almost at the entrance, they stumbled over the body of the eccentric old man who had frequently been seen in this vicinity during the last fortnight. They at once informed the authorities of their discovery, and the remains were taken to an undertaker. Yesterday, they were buried in Pottersfield, and though no one at the grave had known Jules Bourglet, the story of his life, as narrated by the Reverend Mr. Chadwick, drew tears from many eyes. Nearly 25 years ago, a man all clad in leather began to wander through Connecticut and eastern New York. Whence he came or whither he went, no one knew, for he not only kept the secret of his life, but refused to speak on any subject. His dress consisted entirely of leather, bootlegs, tanner's aprons, and odd scraps fastened together with thongs, and he soon became known throughout New England as the Old Leatherman. At all seasons of the year he wandered from place to place, sleeping in barns, under haystacks and hedges, or wherever else he might find shelter, and eating such scraps of food as were given him by the kind-hearted housewives. 5 years ago, while seated on a bench, munching a crust of bread, a Hartford photographer took his picture and has since sold thousands of them to people who had seen the strange original. Last December, the old man was arrested in Middletown at the insistence of the Connecticut Humane Society and taken to a hospital in Hartford, whence he escaped 2 days later and resumed his aimless journeyings. He was subsequently recaptured, however, and after long and earnest entreaties, and believing that death was near, he at last related the story of his life. His name was Jules Bourglet, and for a quarter of a century he did silent and systematic penance for a disastrous failure in early life. He was of French parentage and was born in Lyon nearly 60 years ago. His father was a wool dealer who gave him a liberal education. Young Bourglet became acquainted with the beautiful and accomplished daughter of a wealthy leather merchant named Laron. They fell in love with each other and became engaged before the parents were aware of the attachment. Monsieur Laron was greatly incensed when he learned of the affair, but young Bourglet argued his case in so able and manly a manner as to soften the rich man's heart, and he finally decided to take Jules into the leather business for a year, and if he proved himself energetic and possessed of good business qualities, he was to have as a reward the hand of the daughter in marriage. If, on the other hand, he proved unworthy of confidence, he must give up his suit and go away from Paris. Jules was soon installed in the office of his prospective father-in-law as a confidential agent. This was in 1857. Bourglet speculated largely in leather and carried his operations to such an extent that the result was a crash. Thousands of men in the leather trade were either ruined or thrown out of work, and Jules was found wandering about the street in a half-crazed condition. He became a raving maniac, and for 2 years he was confined in a madhouse. From there, he finally escaped to this country, where all trace of him was lost for years. His relatives finally obtained information of his whereabouts and wrote to the New York authorities giving his history and directing them to spare no expense in finding out his condition both mentally and physically. He was discovered traveling through Connecticut as a journeyman plumber, noted for eccentric behavior and clad entirely in leather. He never took anything but food or tobacco for his work. His relatives were informed that he was harmless and abhorred the society of men or the idea of returning to France. Nothing more was heard of his relatives, and he continued his wanderings until arrested last winter. He escaped a second time and had since been undisturbed by the authorities. Sunday, he was found dead in a cave near Sing Sing. So ends the strange career of the Old Leatherman. February 27, 1889, the day, New London, Connecticut. They are not like other men, queer characters that reside in Connecticut. That famous and mysterious personage, the old Leatherman, is not the only remarkable character that Connecticut can claim as her own. He has several contemporaries, each as odd and wonderful in his way, perhaps, albeit none has ever attained the celebrity that has attached to the modern counterpart of the Wandering Jew, says the Hartford Times. There exists, or until a comparatively recent time, at any rate, did exist, in the woods between Branford and East Haven, a strange, weird, and ghost-like creature, fierce-looking, haggard and gaunt, whose matted beard and unkempt locks and tattered and bedraggled garments made a spectacle most uncanny. This strange creature, for some years past, has been known almost entirely as the Wild Man of the Woods, and his appearance and manner of living have proven the title no misnomer. Some years ago, this wild man was one of the brightest and most esteemed young men in the old town of East Haven. He was from a good family, and his name was Isaac Pardee. He was considered a model youth in every respect, and his friends confidently expected that he would become a great man someday. Pardee, however, had a bitter experience. He had long and ardently courted one of East Haven's fairest daughters, and he had supposed that his undisguised admiration for the village belle had been of a reciprocal nature, until one day he was most cruelly jilted. Pardee and the young lady were engaged to be married, it is said, and the blow was more than his reason could stand. It tottered and fell, and Pardee, from being a shining light in social circles, became a vagabond wanderer, a veritable wild man. For several years, at all events, Pardee roamed the woods, shunning a human being as a pestilence, his only companions the chipmunks and squirrels, and his sustenance presumably the roots and berries that he dug and picked with his hands. Some East Haven people say that Pardee still haunts the woods, and that efforts to capture him have been unsuccessful, while others state that he has at last been caught and sent to a safe retreat where every effort is being made to reclaim his reason. Be this as it may, the case of Isaac Pardee is unquestionably a strange one. The town of Orange has an oddity in the person of Edward Stevens, who was a well-to-do merchant of New Haven. Stevens became involved in speculations that resulted disastrously, and his fortune was swept away. His mind appears to have been somewhat deranged by his misfortunes, although on most matters he appears perfectly rational. Stevens' peculiarity consists in walking a plank. It is his custom to arise at 6 o'clock in the morning, eat his breakfast, and then commences his self-imposed task. He has a plank 8 inches wide and perhaps 10 feet long, and on this he walks back and forth, slowly but without stopping, for 5 hours. Then he takes his dinner and seems to consider his day's work done. This routine he has followed for years. There is a queer old man in Clinton of whom little is known, although his name is said to be Perkins. His peculiar idiosyncrasy is the belief that the British are continually attempting to make a landing on the shores of Long Island Sound, and that it is his bounden duty to repel them. Almost daily he attires himself in a continental uniform that probably belonged to some revolutionary ancestor, buckles on an ancient cutlass, and with his 3-cornered hat and white cockade, takes himself to the shore and struts up and down in anticipation of an attack from the British. There are also other queer ones with whom the public are more or less familiar. Zeb, the hermit fisherman of Stonington, is, perhaps, one of Connecticut's most wonderful characters. He, like young Pardee, was disappointed in love in his youth. He betook himself to a cave and has led the life of a hermit ever since. He is something of a miser, too, and has amassed a considerable fortune. A young man by the name of Quigley is Bridgeport's contribution to the list. He is said to have soured on the world and to have taken his revenge by returning to a hole in the ground, dug by himself, which he calls his cave.